When a young black man is convicted of a violent crime, he didn't commit, the officers who framed him believe there. Corruption will go unnoticed, just like it always has, but they couldn't be more wrong. What they don't anticipate is the man's father, a determined detective who's willing to risk everything to expose the truth. This is a story of systemic corruption, racial bias, and an unwavering pursuit of justice that will change the system forever. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're watching from. If you stand for justice and accountability, be sure to like and subscribe for more stories that matter. The courtroom felt like a cage, its air heavy with unspoken judgments and suffocating tension. DeAndre Harris sat at the defendant's table, his hands gripping the edge as if he could hold back the torrent about to crash over him. His face, youthful and resolute, betrayed flickers of disbelief as the words life imprisonment echoed through the chamber. Judge Lawrence Mitchell, seated high above, delivered the sentence with a voice devoid of emotion. His cold, detached expression pierced through the room, silencing even the faint shuffle of the gallery. For the crimes of robbery and murder, you are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. DeAndre's lips trembled as he stood. I didn't do this, he said, his voice breaking but unwavering. I'm innocent. The first, swear to God I didn't do this. Enough. Judge Mitchell snapped his gavel, striking the sound block with finality. This court is adjourned. In the gallery, Detective Marcus Harris leaned forward, his broad shoulders slumped under the weight of the moment, his eyes locked on his son. Now flanked by two officers, DeAndre turned to meet his father's gaze, his expression a mixture of fear and an unspoken plea for salvation. Marcus felt a knot tighten in his chest, an ache that no amount of training or resilience could soften. The sound of murmured voices swelled as the courtroom emptied. Reporters whispered fervently, their pens scratching furiously against notepads. Clear-cut case, one muttered, open and shut. Another added. Marcus clenched, his rage bubbling beneath his composed exterior. Clear-cut, he thought bitterly. They call it clear-cut when none of this even adds up. As the murmurs of the crowd began to fade, Marcus's mind pulled him back to the trial, the days of arguments and allegations playing like a grim reel. DeAndre's trial had been a farce from the beginning. Marcus replayed the moments in his mind, each memory sharpening his disbelief. The prosecution's star witness, a man with shifty eyes and a wavering voice, had identified DeAndre as the perpetrator of the robbery, yet his testimony contradicted the physical evidence that seemed to conveniently go missing before the trial. The defense attorney, a court-appointed rookie, had pointed out the inconsistencies, but his arguments were met with dismissive scoffs. The surveillance footage from the convenience store, yes, the attorney had argued, would have shown someone else committing the crime. Where is it? Lost during transfer. Officer Derek Shaw had testified, his tone smug and confident. His partner Ryan Peters had sat beside him, his silence an unsettling contrast. Witnesses who could have exonerated DeAndre were either intimidated into silence or mysteriously recanted their statements. One woman, trembling on the stand, had hesitated before saying, I can't be sure it was him anymore. The painful memories faded as Marcus's focus returned to the present. The courtroom now nearly empty except for a few lingering reporters and DeAndre being led away. Move it. One of the officers barked, nudging DeAndre toward the exit. The young man stumbled but kept his chin high, says defiance still flickering in his eyes. Dad, DeAndre called, his voice hoarse. I'm innocent. The first didn't do it. Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. I believe you, son, he said, his deep baritone carrying through the silent courtroom. I'll get to the bottom of this, I promise I will. The officer hauling DeAndre scowled. Keep moving. As the courtroom doors swung shut behind them, Marcus remained rooted in place, his mind raced, every instinct screaming that this wasn't just a miscarriage of justice, it was a deliberate act. The sound of the door slammed echoed in his ears as Marcus slowly turned and made his way outside. Stepping into the harsh light of the afternoon outside the courthouse, Marcus stepped into the sharp afternoon sun. Reporters surrounded him like vultures, microphones and cameras shoved into his face as questions flew. Detective Harris, how do you feel about the conviction? Do you think your son got a fair trial? Is it true the victim's family plans to sue for damages? Marcus raised a hand, his voice calm but firm. I have no comment at this time. He pushed past them, his focus singular. Tasha Monroe, a journalist he'd known for years, approached him, keeping her distance from the pack. Marcus She said softly, "I'm so sorry. If you need anything, let me know." He paused, his expression softening. "Momentarily, thank you, Tasha," he said before continuing to his car. The chaos of the crowd began to fade as Marcus sat alone in his car, his mind already working through his next steps. In the solitude of his car, Marcus gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles whitening. The weight of his badge felt heavier than ever. He had spent his entire career chasing justice, only to see the system he trusted fail his own son. This isn't over. Pulling out his phone, he began scrolling through his contacts. Names of colleagues, old friends, and informants flickered across the screen. He needed allies, people who could help him dig where others wouldn't dare. But first, he needed to revisit the case himself. Every shred of evidence, every testimony, every missing piece. He would dissect it all until the truth surfaced. As Marcus started the engine, his jaw tightened. DeAndre's voice echoed in his mind. Marcus whispered to himself, his determination as unyielding as steel. "I will find the truth, and I will bring them all down." The hum of the engine filled the silence as Marcus drove into the deepening shadows of the city, a siren wailing faintly in the distance, a grim prelude to the battle ahead. The evidence sat scattered across Marcus's dining table, photographs, police reports, and witness statements, all arranged in neat, meticulous piles, yet as orderly as the scene appeared. The inconsistencies within screamed chaos. Marcus flipped through the autopsy report for the third time that night, muttering to himself, how does a bullet trajectory change between the initial report and the trial summary? He whispered, rubbing his temples. And where the hell is the surveillance footage? His phone buzzed on the table, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Tasha Monroe. "Marcus, let me know if you need help with anything. I'm here." He appreciated the gesture, but ignored it. For now, he couldn't afford distractions. Marcus's eyes lingered on a picture of DeAndre smiling brightly at his high school graduation. The memory tugged him backward to a conversation they'd had a few weeks before DeAndre's arrest. Dad, DeAndre had said one evening, his tone unusually serious, "I saw something the other day, something I probably shouldn't have." Marcus, halfway through his coffee, had raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "Something. I was at the precinct," DeAndre continued hesitantly, referring to his occasional visits to drop off his father's lunch. "I saw Shaw and Peters with some bags, looked like drugs, and cash. They were arguing about splitting it. I wasn't close enough to hear everything, but I'm sure that's what it was." Marcus had leaned forward, his face hardening. "Did they see you?" DeAndre had shaken his head. "No, but I think I should report it." Marcus's voice had been firm. "No, you don't get involved. You hear me? If you think something's off, tell me and I'll handle it, but stay out of their way." DeAndre had nodded reluctantly, but the unease hadn't left his face. Now, weeks later, that unease made sense, and Marcus felt a cold pit form in his stomach. Back in the present, Marcus stood abruptly, shoving the autopsy report into a folder. If he was going to find answers, he needed to start with the witnesses. The first was a middle-aged store clerk who had testified seeing DeAndre running from the scene. When Marcus showed up at his shop, the man froze at the sight of him. "You hear about your boy?" the clerk asked, his voice trembling slightly. "I just want the truth," Marcus replied, evenly, setting a photo of DeAndre on the counter. "You testified you saw him, but I'm having a hard time believing that what really happened." The clerk hesitated, glancing toward the back door of the shop as if expecting someone to barge in. I didn't want to testify," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But Shaw and Peters, they said they'd make trouble for me if I didn't." Marcus's jaw tightened. "What kind of trouble?" "They said they'd plant drugs in my car," the man said, eyes darting nervously. "I got kids. I couldn't risk it." Marcus stared at him for a long moment, anger simmering just below the surface. He wanted to press further, but the man's trembling hands told him he wouldn't get much more tonight. "If you remember anything else, call me," Marcus said, leaving his cart on the counter before walking out. Back at his car, Marcus jotted down notes, piecing together a picture that was becoming clearer by the hour. The next stop was a young woman who had initially vouched for DeAndre's alibi but later recanted during the trial. "I can't talk to you," she said when Marcus knocked on her door. "You were close to DeAndre." Marcus pressed gently, his tone steady. "You know he didn't do this." She hesitated, her hand on the edge of the door. "They said if I didn't drop it, they'd arrest my brother," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I had no choice." Marcus's stomach churned. Shaw and Peters had used threats and intimidation to silence witnesses. Standard tax ICS for dirty cops. "I'm not Here to make things harder for you, Marcus assured her, but if you decide to speak up, there are people who can protect you. He left his card again, hoping she'd call when she felt safe enough to do so. By the time Marcus returned to his precinct the next day, he could feel eyes on him. Whispers circulated like smoke in a room with no ventilation. He had spent the better part of his career building respect within the department, but now he could sense the doubts. Should you really be digging into this? One colleague asked cautiously as Marcus rifled through case files. Marcus didn't look up. Why wouldn't I? You know how it looks, don't you? Investigating your son's case. Marcus's hand froze for a second before he continued flipping through the papers. It looks like I'm doing my job. Another officer leaning against the door frame smirked. Careful, Harris, you might not like what you find. The comment wasn't lost on Marcus. He slammed the file shut and turned to face them, his voice firm. The truth is the truth, and if that makes some people uncomfortable, so be it. Alone in his office, Marcus leaned back in his chair, staring at the growing stack of evidence, the coercion of witnesses, the missing footage, the altered autopsy report. All of it pointed to a deliberate effort to frame DeAndre, but why? His thoughts circled back to Shaw and Peter. DeAndre had seen something big enough to make them take drastic measures. The edges of the conspiracy were coming into focus, but Marcus knew this was just the beginning. As the weight of it all settled over him, Marcus took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. They wanted this buried, he muttered to himself, but they didn't count on me digging it back up. The words hung in the air as Marcus picked up his pen and began making a list. Witnesses to revisit, leads to follow, and questions that demanded answers. What will Marcus discover in his investigation, and will he be able to clear DeAndre's name? Give this video a like if you're eager to find out, and comment below if you think DeAndre was framed. Let's continue. The night was still and heavy as Marcus Harris drove through the quiet streets of his city. His car's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating empty sidewalks and shuttered storefronts. His destination, a small convenience store on the edge of a rough neighborhood. It was here weeks before DeAndre's arrest that surveillance footage had allegedly captured the crime, a key piece of evidence that had vanished without explanation. Marcus gripped the wheel tighter. He knew this wasn't just about finding the footage, it was about uncovering a trail deliberately buried. His instincts screamed that this was bigger than his son, but the thought of DeAndre sitting in a prison cell fueled his resolve. The store owner, a wiry man in his 60s named Mr. Alvarez, stood behind the counter eyeing Marcus warily. As the detective stepped inside, "We're closed," Alvarez said gruffly, glancing at the clock on the wall. Marcus raised his hand slightly, a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to shop. I need to ask you some questions about the night of the robbery, the one my son was accused of." Alvarez stiffened, his eyes darting toward the store's back room. "I already told the police everything I know, and yet," Marcus said, leaning on the counter, "the surveillance footage from your cameras disappeared. Convenient, don't you think?" Alvarez shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Marcus's gaze. "It's not my fault. They said there was a problem with the system, a technical issue." Marcus studied him, his expression calm but firm. "Who they?" "Mr. Alvarez." "Was it Shaw and Peter?" The man flinched at the mention of the officer names, his thin fingers drumming nervously against the counter. "Look, I don't want any trouble," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't about trouble," Marcus said, lowering his voice. "This is about justice. My son's life depends on the truth. If you know something, you need to tell me." For a long moment Alvarez was silent, then with a sigh he reached under the counter and pulled out a small notepad. Scribbled across its pages were dates, times, and names. They came by a few days after the robbery. Alvarez admitted, his voice trembling. "Shaw said the footage had to be confiscated for the investigation, but when I asked about it later, Peters told me to mind my business or I'd find myself under investigation too." Marcus's jaw climbed. "Ed, and you didn't think to report this?" Alvarez shook his head. "Are you kidding? They're cops. Who was going to believe me?" Later that night Marcus sat alone in his dimly lit living room, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He stared at a framed photo of DeAndre on the coffee table, his son's bright smile a painful reminder of what was at stake. Had his job consumed him so much that he missed the signs he thought Back to the long nights spent on cases, the missed dinners, and the countless times he had told DeAndre, "We'll talk tomorrow," but tomorrow hadn't come, not the way it should have. He buried his face in his hands, guilt gnawing at him. "I should have been there," he whispered. "I should have seen this coming." His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Tasha Monroe. "Any progress?" Marcus typed back quickly. "Shaw and Peters, that's the thread I just need to pull it." The next morning, Marcus arrived at the precinct with a renewed sense of purpose. He kept his steps measured, his demeanor neutral. If Shaw and Peters caught wind of his investigation, they'd try to bury him, just as they had buried others. As he sifted through old case files, Captain Elaine Torres stopped by his desk. "Harris," she said, her voice low, "where is? You've been asking questions about DeAndre's case." Marcus looked up, meeting her gaze. "I'm not stopping, Torres, not until I find the truth." Torres sighed. "You're walking a fine line, Marcus. Don't make enemies you can't handle." "I can handle them," Marcus replied, his tone resolute. Torres hesitated, then nodded. "Just be careful." As Marcus left the store, he couldn't shake the sour taste Alvarez's words left in his mouth. He had been a detective long enough to know that the kind of fear dirty cops could instill, but seeing it firsthand only solidified his suspicion. Shaw and Peters were systematically silencing anyone who could expose them. Back in his car, Marcus flipped through a folder of complaints against the officers. Most were dismissed as unsubstantiated, but the pattern was clear: a history of intimidation, questionable arrests, and disappearing evidence. One case in particular caught his eye: a young man arrested on drug charges who later claimed Shaw planted the evidence. The charges had been quietly dropped, but the man refused to cooperate, further citing threats to his family. "This isn't a coincidence," Marcus muttered, scribbling notes. As the day wore on, Marcus pieced together more connections, his list of leads growing longer. Shaw and Peters were preying on vulnerable people and using their power to erase evidence. Standing in the precinct's break room, he glanced at his reflection in the window. His determination was etched into his face, the lines around his eyes deepened by sleepless nights. "They framed the wrong man," he said quietly, his voice steady, "and now they're going to pay with that." Marcus gathered his files, his steps purposeful as he walked out the door. The battle ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready for it, and he wouldn't stop until his son was free. The hum of conversation in the coffee shop was a soft backdrop to the tension between Marcus and Tasha as they sat at a corner table. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes sharp and unyielding. Tasha Monroe, her notepad on the table, frowned as she skimmed through her notes. "So let me get this straight," Tasha said, tapping her pen against the page. "You're telling me Judge Mitchell, good old untouchable Lawrence Mitchell, has been making some questionable ruling favoring Shaw and Peters in particular?" Marcus nodded. "It's not just favoring. Look at the pattern: dismissed complaints, blocked evidence, rulings that go out of their way to shield those two, and now DeAndre's case." Tasha sat back, crossing her arms. "That's a big accusation, even for you." Marcus exhaled, his jaw tight. "It's not just an accusation. I've been hearing whispers, rumors about Mitchell taking bribes through a shell company. The timing lines up suspiciously well with DeAndre's trial." Tasha arched an eyebrow. "A shell company? You have proof of this, or is it just another rumor?" "I'm working on it," Marcus admitted, "but I need your help to dig deeper. You've got connections in places I don't." Tasha hesitated, her pen hovering over the notepad. "You realize what you're asking me to do, right? If this goes public and you're wrong, hell, even if you're right, but we don't have enough proof, you'll be throwing gasoline on a bonfire. Mitchell has friends in high places. This could blow back on you hard." Marcus's eyes burned with determination. "I don't care about me. My son's life is at stake. If Mitchell is dirty, the world needs to know, and I'm not stopping until I prove it." Over the next few days, Marcus and Tasha worked tirelessly, combing through court records and financial disclosures. Tasha reached out to her sources, leveraging her reputation as a fearless investigative journalist to pry open doors that would have otherwise stayed shut. "Look at this," Tasha said one evening, sliding a file across the table in her cramped office. "Mitchell's rulings in cases involving Shaw and Peters. You were right every single time he sided with them, throwing out evidence, discrediting witnesses, even dismissing charges outright." Marcus scanned the documents, his frown deepening. "And no one's questioned this, not once." "People have tried," Tasha said grimly, "but they either get shut down or disappear from the legal scene." "Intimidation, maybe, dirty or worse. Marcus nodded, his mind racing. This is bigger than I thought. If Mitchell's been covering for them, it means they've got something on him, or he's been profiting from their corruption. Tasha tapped her laptop, pulling up a series of financial transactions. That's where this comes in. Meet Cloverstone LLC, registered in some offshore haven, no clear owners, but guess who's received deposits from them? Marcus leaned closer, his pulse quickening. Mitchell, bingo. Tasha confirmed the deposits started showing up about 6 months before DeAndre's trial. The amounts aren't astronomical, but they're consistent enough to raise eyebrows if anyone bothered to look. The discovery of Cloverstone LLC was a breakthrough, but Marcus knew it wasn't enough. He needed to tie the money directly to the officers and DeAndre's case. Late one night, he sifted through the files again, his desk cluttered with papers and photos. His phone buzzed. It was Tasha. I found something else, she said, her voice urgent. One of the deposit dates matches the same week Shaw and Peters confiscated that surveillance footage from Alvarez's store. Marcus sat up straighter. You're telling me the money moved right after they buried evidence? Exactly, Tasha said. It's circumstantial, but it's starting to paint a clear picture. They frame your son. Mitchell smooths the path and someone funnels cash into his pocket. Marcus's fist clenched. That bastard sold out my son for a paycheck. Tasha's voice softened. Marcus, listen to me. If you go after Mitchell directly, you'll be putting a target on your back. These are powerful people. You need to be smart about this. Marcus' tone was steel. I didn't sign up for this job to play it safe. My son's sitting in a prison cell for something he didn't do. If Mitchell's dirty, I'm taking him down. Despite her reservations, Tasha continued to help, but the strain of their investigation was starting to show. One night, as they sat in Marcus's living room reviewing their findings, she slammed her laptop shut and let out a frustrated sigh. You're risking everything, Marcus, she said. Your career, your safety, hell, even your credibility. If this doesn't pan out, it will pan out. Marcus interrupted, his voice firm. I know I'm right, and I know what I signed up for when I started this. Tasha shook her head. You're playing with fire, and if Mitchell gets wind of this. Marcus leaned forward, his expression unwavering. Let him. I'm not afraid of him or anyone else. My son didn't get justice in that courtroom, so I'm gonna get it for him no matter what it takes. Tasha stared at him for a long moment before nodding. All right, she said softly, but if we're doing this, we do it right. No shortcuts, no loose ends. Agreed, Marcus said. As the pieces began to come together, Marcus could feel the noose tightening, not around him but around Mitchell, Shaw, and Peters. The evidence was damning, but it wasn't complete yet. He stood by the window staring out at the city lights as the weight of the investigation settled on his shoulders. The risks were high, but the stakes were higher. They've been playing this game for too long, Marcus muttered to himself. It's time to end it. With Tasha by his side and the truth within reach, Marcus knew he was getting closer to the answers he needed, and once he had them, there would be no going back. Marcus Harris sat in the dimly lit diner, the hum of the fluorescent lights above mixing with the low murmur of patrons around him. Across the booth sat Paul Grayson, a former officer turned security guard, his face lined with the stress of secrets long kept. He stirred his coffee absently, his eyes darting to the door every few moments. You didn't hear this from me, Grayson began, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't want any blowback, you understand. Marcus leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. I'm not here to out you, Paul. I'm here to save my son. If you know something about Shaw and Peters, now's the time to say it. Grayson hesitated, glancing around the diner again before sighing deeply. All right, Shaw and Peters, they've been dirty for years, skimming off drug busts, pocketing cash, even planting evidence when it suits them. But your son, he wasn't just unlucky, he saw them in the ACT. Marcus's jaw tightened, his pulse quickening. What did he see? They were in the evidence locker, Grayson explained. DeAndre walked in at the wrong time, saw them taking a stash, drugs and money. They panicked, thought he'd report them, so they set him up to take the fall. Grayson reached into his jacket and pulled out a small USB drive, sliding it across the table. What's this? Marcus asked, his fingers hesitating over the drive. A recording, Grayson said. I had my own suspicions about Shaw and Peters a while back, so I started keeping tabs on them. I caught them talking about you. your son, how they framed him to cover their tracks. I kept it as insurance in case they ever came after me. Marcus picked up the drive, his hand shaking slightly. Why didn't you come forward sooner? Grayson laughed bitterly. Are you serious? Shaw and Peters have the department in their pocket. Internal Affairs might investigate, but they're not exactly immune to pressure. I'm not about to paint a target on my back without a damn good reason. Marcus's grip on the USB tightened. And you think my son rotting in prison isn't a good enough reason? Grayson's gaze softened, but he didn't look away. It is. That's why I'm giving this to you now, but don't think for a second this makes us. Even if they find out I talk to you, they won't. Marcus interrupted, his voice hard as steel. You've done your part, now it's my turn. Back at his apartment, Marcus sat at his desk staring at the USB drive as though it were a live grenade. The room was silent except for the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. Taking a deep breath, he inserted the drive into his laptop and opened the file. The recording crackled to life. Shaw's gruff voice unmistakable. I'm telling you, we had no choice. Shaw said the kid saw too much. If he'd talked, we'd be screwed. Marcus's fist slammed onto the desk as the weight of their words sank in. They had casually destroyed his son's life to save their own skins. The recording continued, delving into details of their scheme, threats to witnesses, tampering with evidence, and using their badge as a shield for their crimes. Marcus's chest tightened as anger and vindication wed within him. He had the proof he needed, but what came next was far from simple. Marcus leaned back in his chair, staring at the dark ceiling. His mind raced, grappling with the decision before him. Taking the evidence to Internal Affairs was the logical move, but Marcus knew the risks. Shaw and Peters were entrenched in the system, and the department had a history of circling the wagons to protect its own. Could he trust Internal Affairs to act swiftly and decisively? On the other hand, confronting Shaw and Peters directly could backfire spectacularly. It might feel satisfying, but it could jeopardize the case, or worse, put Marcus himself in their crosshairs. His phone buzzed on the desk, breaking his thoughts. It was Tasha Monroe. Marcus, she said when he answered, I've been digging into Cloverstone LLC. Some more. I've got enough to tie Judge Mitchell's bribes. To Shaw and Peters, this is the smoking gun you need. Marcus rubbed his temples. I've got a recording time. They admitted everything, framing DeAndre, stealing from evidence, the whole operation. There was a pause on the line. Then what are you waiting for? Tasha asked. I don't know. Marcus admitted. If I don't handle this right, they'll slip through the cracks again. Tasha's voice softened. You're right to be cautious, but Marcus, this isn't just about your son anymore. If you take them down, you could save a lot of other people from being hurt. Marcus ended the call and sat in silence for a long moment. Tasha was right. He picked up the USB drive, his expression hardening. He would take the evidence to Internal Affairs, but not without a plan. He would make sure the case was airtight, with no room for Shaw, Peters, or Mitchell to weasel out. Standing, Marcus grabbed his coat and keys. As he stepped into the night, his resolve was unshakable. His son's life had been stolen, but Marcus would do whatever it took to make things right and ensure that the men responsible would face the consequences. The knock at Marcus's apartment door came just after midnight. Loud and insistent, Marcus grabbed his service pistol from the counter and approached cautiously. Who is it? He barked, his tone sharp. It's me, Marcus. Tasha's voice came through, trembling but familiar. He swung the door open to find her standing there, clutching a laptop bag to her chest. Her face was pale, a thin cut above her eyebrow still trickling blood. What the hell happened? Marcus demanded, ushering her inside. They know, Tasha said breathlessly. Mitchell, Shaw, Peters, they know. We're digging. Someone jumped me outside my office. She dropped into a chair, wincing as she cradled her side. They didn't get anything, but they tried. Marcus, this is getting dangerous. Marcus's jaw clenched. He grabbed a towel, dampened it, and handed it to her for the cut. Did you see their faces? She shook her head. No, they wore masks, but they weren't amateurs. They didn't even say anything, just came at me. He sat across from her, his mind racing. They're trying to scare us off, but this proves we're getting too close. Tasha's eyes flashed. Close isn't good enough, Marcus. We need to end this. The next morning, Marcus stepped outside to find his car vandalized. The windshield field was shattered, and the words "back off" were spray painted in red across the hood. His stomach churned with anger, but he forced himself to stay calm. He snapped a few pictures for evidence, then dialed the precinct. Captain Torres, he said when she answered, "I need you to send someone to my place. My car's been hit." Torres's voice was laced with concern. "This connected to your investigation?" "Absolutely," Marcus replied. "It's Shaw and Peter. They're feeling the heat and they're pushing back." Torres sighed heavily. "Be careful, Marcus. These guys don't play by the rules. Neither do I when my son's life is on the line," Marcus said, ending the call. Marcus sat in the DA's office across from an assistant district attorney, Rebecca Langston, a sharp, non-nonsense prosecutor who had a reputation for taking down powerful figures. "Are you sure about this?" Langston asked, flipping through the evidence Marcus had handed over. "This is a career-ending move for Mitchell and a career-ending risk for you if this goes sideways." "I'm not here for my career," Marcus said firmly. "I'm here for my son. You want corruption off your docket here. It is gift-wrapped." Langston leaned back in her chair, studying him. "Shaw and Peters won't go quietly, and if Mitchell's involved, he's not going to sit there and let us take him down. Then we make it so airtight they don't have a choice," Marcus said. "I've got recordings, witnesses, and a trail of money that leads right to Mitchell's front door. You in or out?" Langston smirked faintly. "I'm in, but if we're doing this, we do it by the book. No slip." UPS. Later that evening, Marcus parked his car outside a diner, intending to grab a quick coffee and regroup. As he stepped out, he noticed a familiar figure leaning against a nearby lamp post. "Shaw." Marcus's muscles tensed as Shaw pushed off the pole and Ed over his expression cocky. "Detective Harris," Shaw drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "Burning the midnight oil, huh? You should really let this thing with your son go. It's not going to end the way you think." Marcus squared his shoulders, his voice calm but firm. "And how do you think it'll end?" "Shaw, you threatening me, my family. That just makes me more certain I'm on to something." Shaw's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing. You don't know who you're messing with." "No, Shaw," Marcus shot back, stepping closer, his tone ice cold. "You don't know who you're messing with. I've got enough on you and Peters to bury both of you, and I'm just getting started." Shaw's jaw tightened. "You're bluffing." "Try me," Marcus said, his gaze unflinching. "But if you come near me, my family, or anyone else I care about again, I promise you'll regret it." They stared each other down, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, Shaw smirked again, but there was no humor in it. "You're making a mistake, Harris. One you can't undo." Marcus watched him walk away, his resolve hardening with every step. That night, Marcus called Tasha and Torres to lay out the next steps. "We're pushing forward," Marcus said. "Shaw knows we're on to him, but we've got enough to bring this to internal affairs and Langston. It's time to blow this wide open." Tasha sounded weary but determined. "I'll keep digging into Mitchell's financials. If there's anything else, I'll find it." "Good," Marcus said. "Torres, can you handle the department? Make sure no one buries this." "I'll do my best," Torres replied, "but watch your back." "Marcus, these guys are desperate." "I always do," Marcus said grimly. The internal affairs office buzzed with quiet urgency as Marcus entered, a thick folder under his arm. "Captain Elaine." Torres was already waiting for him in the conference room, her expression as sharp as the tailored suit she wore. "You'd better have something solid, Harris," she said as he took a seat across from her. "If we're going after Shaw, Peters, and Mitchell, we can't afford any holes." Marcus opened the folder, laying out copies of financial records, witness statements, and a transcript of the recording Grayson had given him. "This isn't just solid, Torres, it's a damn mountain." Torres picked up the transcript, her eyes scanning the page. "This recording alone is enough," she muttered, "but we'll need corroboration. Mitchell's defense team will fight this tooth and nail." Marcus leaned forward. "I've started convincing witnesses to testify. Alvarez and the young woman who recanted, they're scared, but they're coming around. Anisha is still digging into Mitchell's offshore accounts. She's close to finding the missing link." Torres looked up, her eyes narrowing. "You trust her with my life," Marcus said firmly. "She's as committed to this as I am." "The first stop was Alvarez's convenience store." The older man looked up as Marcus entered, his hands tightening on the counter. "Your back," Alvarez said, his voice wary. "I already told you everything I know." Marcus nodded. "And I appreciate that, but now I need you to say it officially. We're building a case against Shaw and Peters, and your testimony could be the key to bringing them down." Alvarez shook his head. You don't get it. Those guys, they're dangerous. If I speak out, they're already exposed." Marcus interrupted. "The more people step up, the harder it'll be for them to retaliate. You're not alone in this, Alvarez, and I'll make sure you and your family are protected, the man hesitated, his eyes darting to the back room. After a long pause, he sighed. All right, I'll do it, but you'd better keep your promise, Harris. You have my word, Marcus said, clasping his shoulder. The next visit was to the young woman who had recanted her alibi for DeAndre during the trial. She opened the door cautiously, her expression a mix of fear and regret. I can't go through this again, she said before Marcus could speak. You don't have to do it alone, Marcus said gently. I know they threatened you, but this is your chance to make things right. If you testify, we can put them away for good. Tears well in her eyes, but she nodded slowly. I'll do it for DeAndre. Back at the precinct, Marcus and Torres pored over financial records late into the night. Here, Torres said, pointing to a line on one of the documents, this deposit from Cloverstone LLC. It matches the date Shaw and Peters confiscated the surveillance footage from Alvarez's store. Marcus leaned over her shoulder, his pulse quickening. And there's another deposit it right before DeAndre's trial. They were paying Mitchell to ensure a conviction. Torres nodded grimly. This connects the dots between Shaw, Peters, and Mitchell, but we need a direct tie to DeAndre's case. Marcus smirked. That's where Tasha comes in. Later that evening, Marcus met Tasha in her office. She handed him a printed spreadsheet, her face lit with triumph. Got it, she said. Mitchell's offshore account received a transfer from Cloverstone LLC 2 days before DeAndre's trial. The exact amount matches the bribe Shaw and Peters took during the drug bust. Marcus scanned the document, his chest tightening with both anger and relief. This is it. This proves Mitchell was bought and paid for. Tasha leaned back in her chair. What's next? Marcus's expression hardened. We take this to Torres and Langston. It's time to bring them down. The next day, Marcus sat with Torres and Langston, laying out the final pieces of the puzzle. This is airtight, Langston said, her tone serious, but we need to move carefully. Mitchell's got connections. If he catches wind of this, he'll destroy whatever's left of the evidence. Torres crossed her arms. We coordinate a simultaneous raid, hit Shaw, Peters, and Mitchell at the same time. No chance for them to warn each other or cover their tracks. Marcus nodded. I'll handle the witnesses. They're ready to testify, but we need to keep them safe until the trial. Langston leaned forward. You've done good work, Harris, but this is where it gets tricky. These guys are cornered, and that makes them dangerous. Marcus's jaw tightened. Let them come. I'm not backing down. As the meeting ended, Marcus walked out of the building, his resolve unshakable. He had started this fight to clear his son's name, but now it was about more than just DeAndre. It was about justice for everyone. Shaw, Peters, and Mitchell had hurt. With the case fully built and the evidence irrefutable, Marcus knew the end game was near. The conspirators had nowhere left to hide, and he would make sure they paid for what they had done. The sun filtered through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Judge Lawrence Mitchell sat at the head of his chambers, flipping through a stack of case files, his expression calm and composed. The routine of his day gave no hint of the storm about to descend. The heavy oak doors burst open, and 3 officers from Internal Affairs stepped in. Their badges flashing behind them stood Marcus Harris, his gaze fixed on the man who had condemned his son. Judge Lawrence Mitchell, the lead-off officer, announced, her voice firm. You are under arrest for accepting bribes, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to frame an innocent man. Mitchell's hand froze mid-page, his face drained of color as the reality of the situation struck. This is absurd, he sputtered, standing abruptly. I'm a sitting judge. You have no right. We have every right, the officer interrupted, stepping forward with handcuffs. We've got the evidence. You're done. The room, once a space of quiet authority, now buzzed with tension as clerks and attorneys peered through open doors. Whispers rippled across the halls as Mitchell was led out in cuffs, his defiance replaced by humiliation. At the precinct, the smell of grilled burgers and laughter filled the air as officers gathered for an informal barbecue in the back lot. Shaw and Peters stood by the grill, joking with colleagues, their confident demeanor unshaken by the chaos brewing behind the scenes. Suddenly the gate swung open and unmarked cars rolled in, flanked by squad cars. Officers from Internal Affairs poured out, their movements purposeful and deliberate. Shaw's grin faltered as he caught sight of Marcus stepping out of one of the cars, followed by Captain Torres. "What the hell is this, Shaw?" growled. Stepping forward, Torres ignored him, nodding to her team. "Derek Shaw and Ryan Peters, you're under arrest for corruption, evidence tampering, and conspiracy." Peters laughed nervously. "You can't be serious. This some kind of joke?" "Not a joke," Marcus said coldly, stepping closer. "It's justice." Before either man could respond, the officers moved in, cuffing them as their colleagues looked on in stunned silence. "You're making a mistake," Shaw yelled, struggling against his restraints. "You'll regret this, Harris." Marcus leaned in, his voice low and unyielding. "The only mistake was thinking you'd get away with it." The barbecue fell silent as Shaw and Peters were escorted to waiting squad cars, the image of two once untouchable officers being taken down in front of their peers was a sobering reminder of the reckoning now underway. As the convoy of squad cars pulled away, Marcus stood at the edge of the lot, his hands in his pockets. Satisfaction burned in his chest, but it was tempered by the weight of everything that had been lost. Torres joined him, her arms crossed. "You did good, Harris," she said quietly. Marcus nodded, but didn't look at her. "I did what I had to do." "Doesn't make it any easier," Torres sighed. "No, it doesn't, but it's a start, and that's more than most people get." Marcus watched the cars disappear into the distance, the faces of his son and the countless others wronged by the system flashing in his mind. The arrests dominated the evening news, the story breaking across every major outlet tonight in a dramatic turn of events. Judge Lawrence Mitchell, along with officers Derek Shaw and Ryan Peters, has been arrested on charges of corruption, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice, a reporter announced on the screen. Interviews with community leaders and legal experts filled the airwaves. Their voice is a mix of outrage and hope. "This case highlights the deep systemic issues within our legal and law enforcement institutions," said one commentator. "It's not just about these three individuals, it's about a culture that allowed them to operate unchecked for so long." Calls for reform grew louder as protests sprang up outside the courthouse in precinct, demanding accountability and transparency. At home, Marcus sat in the quiet of his living room, the television muted as images of the arrests played on a loop. The weight of the day pressed down on him. DeAndre's face appeared in his mind, his son's laugh, his determination, and the pain of watching him led away in cuffs. This was a victory, but it wasn't the end. The scars left by the ordeal would take time to heal. "Tasha," called, her voice a mix of excitement and exhaustion. "You saw the news?" Marcus nodded, though she couldn't see it yet. "It's everywhere. They're not just talking about the arrests," she said. "They're talking about reform, about changing the system." Marcus's voice softened. "Good, it needs to change." As he ended the call, Marcus leaned back, his eyes drifting to a family photo on the mantle. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope. The fight wasn't over, but the tide was finally turning. And for Marcus, that was enough to keep going. The courtroom was silent, the atmosphere thick with anticipation as the judge prepared to deliver the final verdict. Marcus Harris sat near the back, his heart pounding as he looked at the defense table. DeAndre, his son, sat tall and resolute beside his lawyer. Across the room, Derek Shaw, Ryan Peters, and Judge Lawrence Mitchell sat with slumped shoulders, the weight of their crimes etched into their pale faces. The judge cleared her throat, her voice firm yet steady. "After reviewing the evidence, it is the decision of this court to overturn the conviction of DeAndre Harris." Gasps and murmurs filled the room, but the judge raised a hand silencing them. She turned her gaze to DeAndre, her tone softening. "Mr. Harris, this court recognizes the grave injustice done unto you. While no ruling can undo the harm caused, I extend my sincerest apologies." DeAndre nodded, his voice steady despite the emotion brimming in his eyes. "Thank you, Your Honor." The judge shifted her attention to the three conspirators, and now for the sentencing of Derek Shaw, Ryan Peters, and Lawrence Mitchell. Marcus leaned forward, holding his breath as the judge continued. For their role in conspiracy, corruption, and obstruction of justice, Derek Shaw and Ryan Peters are each sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Judge Mitchell, for accepting bribes and perverting the course of justice, is sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. The gavel struck a definitive end to the courtroom drama. The air felt lighter as the crowd erupted in murmurs, but Marcus sat back in his chair, exhaling deeply. The fight was over. Justice had been served. As the courtroom emptied, Marcus stood by the doorway waiting for his son. DeAndre approached him, his expression a mixture of relief and sadness. for a moment. Neither of them spoke. Then Marcus opened his arms and DeAndre stepped into the embrace. "I'm so sorry, son," Marcus whispered, his voice breaking. "I should have protected you. I should have." DeAndre shook his head, pulling back slightly. "You did everything you could, Dad. You saved me. That's all that matters now." Marcus studied his son's face, noticing the faint lines of exhaustion and the hardened edge to his eyes. He had always known DeAndre as vibrant, full of life, but the experience had left its mark. Outside the courthouse, a sea of reporters waited, their cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. As soon as Marcus and DeAndre appeared, "Mr. Harris, how does it feel to finally be free?" One reporter shouted. "What do you want to say to the officers who framed you?" Another asked. DeAndre hesitated, glancing at Marcus, who gave him an encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, DeAndre stepped forward. "I'm grateful to finally have my freedom back," he began, his voice carrying over the crowd. "But this isn't just about me, it's about the countless others who are still behind bars for crimes they didn't commit, people who don't have someone fighting for them like I did." The crowd fell silent, hanging on his every word. "My father never gave up on me," DeAndre continued, his voice steady. "He believed in my innocence when no one else did, but it shouldn't take a miracle to get justice. The system needs to change so no one else has to go through what I did." Marcus stepped forward, placing a hand on DeAndre's shoulder. "This case isn't just a victory for my son," he said, addressing the crowd. "It's a wake-up call. There are flaws in our system that allow corruption and bias to destroy lives. We can't ignore that anymore. Accountability isn't optional, it's necessary." The reporters clamored for more, but Marcus raised a hand to signal the end of the statement. "That's all for now," he said firmly. "Thank you." Later that evening, father and son sat on the porch of their modest home, the quiet hum of the neighborhood a stark contrast to the chaos of the day. DeAndre stared into the distance, his expression pensive. "I don't even know where to start, Dad. My friends moved on, my life's on pause, and I feel like a stranger to the world." Marcus placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "You don't have to figure it all out tonight," he said gently. "One step at a time. Remember, you've got your freedom, and you've got me. That's enough for now." DeAndre nodded slowly, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Thanks, Dad, for everything." Marcus smiled faintly. "Always. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, please give the video a like and subscribe for more.